A single act of violence can ripple through families for decades. The victims are gone, but their absence is felt every day. Birthdays missed, chairs left empty, and questions that never fade. Communities are shaken, loved ones left wondering how it could happen, and hope grows thin over the years. Some cases remain cold for decades, but with time, dedication, and advances in investigation, even the oldest mysteries can be solved. Trigger warning. Before we continue, please be advised that this video contains descriptions of heinous acts and disturbing details that may be disturbing to some viewers. We approach these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Viewer discretion is advised. In the crisp air of a Valentine's weekend in 1974, Fort Worth, Texas, was a world of innocent teenage romance. For 17-year-old Carla Walker, a vivacious cheerleader from Western Hills High School, the night was a dream. She was with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, a high school quarterback who was borrowing his mom's car, a Ford LTD. After their school dance, they did what teenagers have done for generations. They found a quiet, private spot in the parking lot of a local bowling alley. It was a perfect, timeless moment that should have been just another cherished memory in the young love story of two high school sweethearts. But as Rodney and Carla sat in the car, a terrifying sound shattered the tranquility. The passenger door suddenly swung open. Before they could even grasp what was happening, a man was there, lunging into the car. He didn't say a word. He just began striking with the weapon, and Rodney fell into unconsciousness. Rodney's last lucid memory was a snapshot of pure terror. Carla's face, her scream for help, and her final, desperate words, "Rodney, go get my dad." When Rodney finally came to, his face covered in blood and his head throbbing with pain, he was alone. Carla was gone. In a state of shock, he ran to her parents' home, a terrified, gravely hurt mess. He could only repeat the same horrifying phrase over and over, "They've got her. They've got her." A frantic, agonizing search began. The entire community was mobilized. Police and volunteers scoured the area, but there was no sign of the high school cheerleader. 3 days later, the worst fears were confirmed. Carla's body was found in a remote culvert in Lake Benbrook, miles from the abduction site. The autopsy revealed a horrifying truth. She had been subjected to horrific abuse, horrifically mistreated, and had lost her life by strangulation. The medical examiner also noted that she had been injected with morphine, indicating her ordeal had lasted for a significant period after she was taken. The crime was a vicious anomaly in their small community, and investigators were baffled. At the scene, they found a single piece of evidence that corroborated Rodney's account, a .22 Ruger pistol magazine that the assailant had dropped. They also found crucial DNA evidence on Carla's clothing. But in the 1970s, DNA technology was still a distant concept. The case grew colder with every passing year. Rodney McCoy, a young man haunted by the last memory of the girl he loved, moved to Alaska in a desperate attempt to escape the pain. Carla's family was left with an unbearable void, a tragedy that became a part of their every waking moment. The police interviewed numerous suspects, including a man named Glenn Samuel McCurley, who owned a Ruger pistol that used the same magazine found at the scene. When questioned, McCurley claimed the gun had been stolen. He even agreed to a polygraph test, which he passed, and was subsequently eliminated as a suspect. For 46 years, the file collected dust on a shelf. But in 2020, the Fort Worth Police Department's Cold Case Unit, led by detectives Jeff Bennett and Leah Wagner, took a new look at the case with a radical new tool. forensic genetic genealogy. They sent the most crucial piece of evidence, a DNA stain from Carla's bra strap, to a private lab specializing in degraded DNA samples. What happened next was a stunning breakthrough. The results pointed them back to an unlikely suspect, the very man they had questioned and cleared almost half a century ago, Glenn Samuel McCurley. The detectives, however, trusted science over a flawed polygraph test from the 70s. They began a new investigation, obtaining a DNA sample from his trash to confirm the genetic match. The results were undeniable. It was later confirmed with a cheek swab. When McCurley's trial began, the prosecution presented a shocking piece of evidence. The very same Ruger pistol he had claimed was stolen back in 1974. The gun had been found decades later, and a ballistics expert confirmed it was consistent with the crime scene. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of evidence, the now 77-year-old McCurley changed his plea to guilty in exchange for a life sentence. It was a moment of liberation for Carla's family, who had carried this sorrow for so long. Though McCurley died a year later in prison, the resolution proved that the past can always be found. On a quiet night in October 1970, a 28-year-old court reporter named Nancy Bennallack went to bed in her Sacramento apartment. She was vibrant, full of life, and just weeks away from her wedding to the love of her life. She was at the very peak of her life, with a future full of promise. But that future was taken from her in a shocking act of violence that has haunted her family for more than 5 decades. When Nancy didn't show up for work the next morning, a co-worker sent her son to check on her. He found her body in her bedroom, a horrific scene where she had been attacked repeatedly with a knife, almost to the point of fatal mutilation. Investigators quickly determined the killer had gained entry through her balcony. But one of the most chilling details was that the killer had taped his fingertips, presumably in a calculated attempt to avoid leaving fingerprints. It was a move that spoke of a cold, methodical mind. Yet for all his careful planning, the killer made one critical mistake. He cut himself during the attack, perhaps when Nancy fought back with her hands and left a trail of his blood drops from her apartment, down her balcony and across the parking lot. The trail led nowhere, and the case went cold, leaving Nancy's devastated fiancé, her family, and her friends to wonder for 52 agonizing years who could have committed such a brutal act. Decades passed. The blood drops were preserved, but the technology to use them for a full identification was nowhere near capable. In 2004, a DNA profile was finally developed from the blood, but produced no match in national databases. That all changed in 2019, when a determined cold case unit used a new, groundbreaking technique, forensic genetic genealogy. They submitted the DNA profile from the blood drops to a genealogy database. Bit by bit, they built a family tree, meticulously tracking down every branch. And that family tree led them to an unbelievable suspect, a man who lived just across the way, Richard John Davis. The details that followed were stunning. Richard Davis was 27 years old at the time of the murder, and he lived in the very same apartment complex as Nancy, just yards from the crime scene. But here's the most heartbreaking twist. Richard Davis had died in 1997 from what investigators believe were complications from alcoholism. He would never face justice in a courtroom for his crime. At a press conference, retired detective Mickey Lynx, who had worked the case for years, expressed the somber reality that there would be no legal justice. But for Nancy's family, it was a bittersweet moment. After 52 years, They had their answer, but they were robbed of justice in the way they deserved. It was a quiet evening on March 29, 1975, when 16-year-old Sharon Prior left her home in the Pointe-Saint-Charles neighborhood of Montreal to meet her friends and boyfriend at a local pizzeria. She had a kind heart, a warm smile, and dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian. It was a walk she had taken countless times before, but on this night, she never arrived. When Sharon didn't return home by 11 p.m., her mother called the police, and a frantic, intensive search began, with the entire community joining in. But 3 days later, her body was found in a wooded area in the nearby city of Longueuil, miles away from where she disappeared. She had been viciously attacked, severely struck, and lost her life by strangulation. Investigators found one of the most important pieces of evidence on the scene, a man's T-shirt that had been used to restrain her. For 48 years, the case remained a mystery that haunted the city and the Prior family. The DNA on the T-shirt was insufficient for testing with the technology of the time, but it was carefully preserved in the hopes that one day it would be the key. Over the decades, Sharon's parents passed away, never getting the closure they so desperately sought. Her sisters, however, never gave up. They kept her story alive in the hope that one day technology would finally catch up with the crime. They lived their lives, always with the burden of this question hanging over them, never knowing who took their sister. And in 2022, it did. A new police unit used modern DNA techniques to finally extract a full DNA profile from the T-shirt. They uploaded it to a genealogy website and began building a family tree, meticulously sifting through countless names and connections. The search was long and grueling, but it finally led them to a name: Franklin Maywood Ramin. He was an American with a violent criminal history who had lived in Montreal at the time of the murder. But the investigators discovered that Ramin had died in 1982. The discovery brought a complex mix of emotions. The family finally had a name, but the killer would never face a judge or jury. But investigators took the investigation a dramatic step further to be absolutely certain. Canadian authorities obtained a court order to exhume his body from a cemetery in West Virginia. The DNA from his remains was a perfect match to the DNA found at the crime scene. The 48-year-long search for Sharon's killer was finally over. The family held a press conference, with Sharon's sister Doreen saying, "The solving of Sharon's case will never bring Sharon back, but knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth and won't kill anymore brings us to somewhat of a closure. It took a lifetime and an extraordinary act for the family to get their answer. We've covered some truly remarkable breakthroughs so far. If you're finding these stories compelling, please consider subscribing to MURK Files and leaving a like on the video. Your support helps us continue to share these important cases." In October 1984, the small, quiet community of Queensville, Ontario, was shattered. 9-year-old Christine Jessup vanished from her rural home. Her disappearance was a national tragedy, with her innocent face on every television and in every newspaper. 3 months later, on New Year's Eve, her body was found in a nearby stream. She had been subjected to horrific abuse and killed. The community was gripped by fear and anger. But what followed was an unimaginable injustice. Police, under intense pressure, charged her neighbor, Guy Paul Morin. He insisted on his innocence, but despite his pleas, he was wrongfully convicted in 1992. Morin would spend years in prison, with the true killer still at large. Christine's story became a symbol of a failed justice system, a heartbreaking example of how a flawed investigation can ruin more than one life. It was only due to advancements in DNA technology that Guy Paul Morin was finally exonerated in 1995. He was free, but the case of who really killed Christine remained a haunting mystery. It's a terrifying thought. For a decade, an innocent man was in jail, while the real killer lived in the community, free and undetected. The wrongful conviction led to a public inquiry into the case and the practices of the police and prosecution. But in 2020, new technology finally gave the Jessup family and Guy Paul Morin the answers they had waited so long for. Police took an unknown DNA sample from Christine's underwear and sent it to a US lab, which used genetic genealogy to find a familial lineage. From this lineage, a new name surfaced: Calvin Hoover. He was a family friend who had worked with Christine's father and was a known face to the family. He was never a suspect in the initial investigation. When authorities went to tell Christine's family, her father was devastated, but said he felt sickened by the news that someone they knew was responsible. They delivered the news to Guy Paul Morin as well, who said, "The justice system failed me, but science saved me." The truth had finally come out, but the killer had ended his life in 2015, just 5 years before his identity was revealed. On Valentine's Day in 1985, a young woman in Arlington, Texas, had a special gift she couldn't wait to give to her fiancé. 22-year-old Terry McAdams had baked a heart-shaped cake for him, a token of her deep love. He was away on a business trip, but she was staying in his apartment, waiting for his return. Instead of a happy reunion, Terry was met with an intruder who broke in through a sliding glass door. She was viciously attacked, subjected to horrific abuse, and lost her life by strangulation. The Tarrant County medical examiner ruled her cause of death as blunt force trauma. The only evidence left behind was the killer's DNA, but like so many others at the time, there was no way to use it. The case went cold, and the pain for her family was overwhelming. But for her family, the clock never stopped ticking. Decades passed with no answers, but the Arlington Police Department never closed the file. It was a case that haunted the detectives and weighed heavily on the McAdams family. For almost 40 years, it was an open wound. Then, in 2023, the department decided to try one last time. They reached out to the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy team. They had one last hope. The DNA profile from the crime scene was submitted to the genealogy database. It was a long shot, but it finally led to a name: Bernard Sharp. The name rang a bell for detectives who had worked the original case. Sharp was a registered sex offender who had been questioned early on, but was never considered a serious suspect because he had a verified alibi. But this is where the story takes a tragic and yet completely shocking turn. The investigation revealed that 9 months after Terry's murder, Bernard Sharp had been involved in a case where he took both lives in Arlington. He had shot and killed 2 people before turning the gun on himself. The case was closed with a bittersweet sense of justice. Terry's sister, Karen Hooper, spoke after the announcement, her voice full of emotion. She said, "After so many long years, we had come to accept that we would probably never know who murdered our sister. I know that she and my mum and dad are smiling down on this miraculous moment. It was a miracle indeed. The detectives who had worked the case for so long finally got to deliver the news they had been waiting to give for decades." On the morning of September 21, 1996, 15-year-old Danni Houchins left her home in Belgrade, Montana. A high-spirited and adventurous teenager who loved the outdoors, she was driving her truck to a local fishing spot, a place of peace and tranquility. When she never returned, her worried mother found her daughter's truck abandoned at the fishing site. Later that night, the worst was confirmed. Danni's body was found face down in the shallow water of the Gallatin River. She had been assaulted and smothered. Investigators meticulously collected DNA evidence, including 4 hairs from Danni's body that were believed to belong to the killer. Despite their best efforts, the case went cold, leaving her family heartbroken and the community haunted by the fear that a monster was still among them. The case remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, but in 2021, a new sheriff took over and decided to take a fresh look at the file. They knew they had the DNA from the hairs, and they knew technology had advanced. With the help of outside experts, they used forensic genetic genealogy to build a family tree from those 4 hairs. The search was long and painstaking, but it finally led to a name: Paul Hutchinson. Hutchinson was a married father of 2 with no criminal history, who had lived about 100 miles away from the crime scene at the time. On July 23, 2024, investigators located and interviewed Hutchinson. They watched his every move as they spoke with him for nearly 2 hours. They noted his extreme nervousness, his profuse sweating, the way he scratched his face and chewed on his hand when shown a photo of Danni. It was clear something was wrong. Upon leaving the interview, his behavior was observed to be erratic. The very next morning, Hutchinson was found dead on the side of the road. He had taken his own life with a firearm. His decision to end his own life was a final, damning confession. Danni's younger sister, Stephanie Mollett, spoke at a news conference, her voice full of raw emotion. She said that while he would never face a jury, she had no doubt he was the killer. When the time came to face up and account for his violence, she said, he instead chose to end his life. He knew of his guilt and couldn't face my family or his family and the pain he caused. Our final story is different from the others. It's not about finding a killer, but about giving a name back to a victim. In the 1990s, the community of Westfield, Indiana, was rocked by a horrifying discovery. On a sprawling 18-acre estate, police found the remains of dozens of men. The home belonged to a man named Herbert Baumeister, a notorious killer who ended his life before he could be brought to justice. He had taken all the secrets of his victims' names with him to the grave. For decades, families wondered if their loved ones were among the unidentified remains found at Baumeister's farm. The DNA technology of the 90s was not advanced enough to identify many of the victims, but one mother never gave up hope. Alan Livingston's mother, Sharon, had a powerful intuition, a gut feeling that her son was one of the men buried on that property. Alan had disappeared in 1993, and his mother believed he was one of Baumeister's victims. But for 30 years, she was met with no new information every time she called. In 2022, her nephew, Alan's cousin, Eric Pranger, reached out to the Hamilton County Coroner's Office to ask them to take another look. At the time, Alan's mother, Sharon, had been diagnosed with cancer. The thought of passing away without knowing her son's fate was a profound pain she had lived with for a long time. The coroner and a team of experts, including a forensic anthropologist, sent a small piece of one of the remaining bones for advanced DNA analysis, something impossible in the 90s. The DNA was processed and uploaded to a genealogy database, and the impossible happened. In 2023, a bone was identified as belonging to Alan Livingston. The coroner called Alan's mother, Sharon, to tell her the news. She finally got the closure she had been waiting for 30 years. She passed away just a month later, but she died knowing her son's remains had been found. Alan's sister, Shannon Doughty, said it best. The fear of the unknown is the worst, right? So just knowing. It's a multitude of emotions. You wanted to know, but you didn't want to know. But you needed to know. It was a powerful, final act of a mother's love, proving that even after death, the truth can still bring peace. These stories prove that no case is ever truly cold. With each year, science sharpens, hope grows, and justice edges closer. They remind us that a mother's instinct, a sister's persistence, and an investigator's refusal to give up can change everything. A life may be stolen, but the truth always finds a way to surface. What do you think about these cases? Please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. If you're new here, hit subscribe for more chilling true crime stories. Stay curious, stay safe.